I want you to stop for a second, because this isn't the story you think it is. You read that title and you probably imagined a gunfight, maybe a rescue, a cowboy riding in on a white horse, saving the day, getting the girl. You've seen that story 100 times, in dime novels, in picture shows, in every saloon song that romanticizes the frontier like it was something clean and simple. This isn't that. What happened to me in Tucson, in the summer of 1883, started with a purchase order for a Winchester rifle, and ended with me carrying a woman I barely knew across 3 miles of open desert in the dark. Her wrist bound with my bandana, her blood soaking through the cloth, her lips moving in a language I didn't speak but somehow understood. There are things that change you. Not slowly the way age does, grinding you down like sand against rock, but fast, immediate, the way a brand hits skin. This was one of those things. I've written it down 3 times now and thrown it away twice, because words kept making it sound like something noble, like I was the hero, like I knew what I was doing. I didn't. I was scared. I was out of my depth, and every decision I made could have gotten both of us killed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started with a weapon. It always starts with something ordinary. I keep a ledger. Not the kind that ranchers use for cattle counts and grain costs, though I have those too, stacked under my bunk at the Calder spread outside of Tucson. I mean a different kind, a personal one. Small, leather-bound, the size of my palm, that I've carried in my left breast pocket since my mother gave it to me when I left Missouri at 17. She said, "Write down the things that surprise you, so you remember the world is bigger than you think it is." She was a school teacher. She believed in documentation. I filled 11 of those ledgers. The one I'm writing in now is the 12th. The entry for June 14th, 1883 begins. Went into town for the Winchester. Came back with something else entirely. And then I crossed it out and didn't write anything else for 3 days. It was a Wednesday. I know because we just done the midweek count on the South Pasture, and I'd been assigned the supply run on account of Denny Briggs spraining his ankle trying to rope a calf that turned out to be angrier than advertised. Boss Calder gave me a list. Hardware nails, 2 spools of wire, feed sacks, and at the bottom, underlined 1 Winchester model 1873.44 caliber for the bunkhouse. We'd had trouble with coyotes, maybe worse than coyotes. There'd been rumors out of the ranches further south that someone was cutting fence lines in the night, and Calder wasn't a man who liked being vulnerable, especially with the summer grazing routes opening up. So I hitched the wagon, tucked my ledger in my pocket, and rode into Tucson under a sky that was already white with heat before 9 in the morning. Tucson in summer smells like dust and creosote, and something underneath both of those things that I've never found a word for. Something ancient, like the land is breathing out a history too long for anyone currently alive to read. I liked it. Most people from back east couldn't stand it. I liked it. Senor Vega's trading post was on the north end of the main street, past the assay office and the telegraph station, and the barber shop where old Harlan Metz sat in the window every single morning like a painting of a man rather than an actual one. Vega's was where you went for firearms. He stocked clean. He didn't ask too many questions, and he kept water in a barrel by the door that he refilled every morning, which in Tucson passed for genuine hospitality. I tied the horse, logged the time in my ledger, a habit ridiculous. My bunkmates made fun of it and pushed inside. The shop was dim. 2 lanterns, both low. The smell of gun oil and cedar and something else, something that didn't belong, something sharp and biological under the wood smoke. I almost missed her. She was in the back corner between a rack of bridles and a shelf of canned goods, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest. Not hiding exactly, not quite in the open either. Like someone who had made a calculation about how much visibility was safe and landed here, in this middle space, this in-between. She was Apache. I could see that immediately, the high cheekbones, the dark braid that had partially come loose, the moccasin boots that were soft leather and beaded at the ankle. She was maybe 30, maybe younger, it was hard to tell. Her left arm was braced against her ribs in a way that spoke of pain before she said a single word. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at the door. Watching it the way you watch something you're afraid of. Vega was behind the counter, and he was doing something I'd never seen him do before, which was nothing. Usually the man was in motion, polishing, cataloging, talking, selling. He was a talker, Vega, the kind of man who could narrate a trip to the outhouse and make it interesting. He was standing still with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. "Buenos dias," I said. "Rancher," he nodded. "What do you need?" I told him, Winchester .44 for Calder. He turned to get it and I stayed where I was and did what I always do when I'm in a room with something I don't understand. I started watching and taking mental notes. Old habit from the ledger keeping, my mother's training. The woman in the corner hadn't moved, but her eyes had shifted. She was watching me now, not the door. I didn't stare. I've spent enough time around people who have been made to feel like spectacles to know that a held gaze can be its own kind of violence. I kept my eyes on Vega. But I was aware of her, the way you're aware of heat, even when you're not looking at the fire. Vega came back with the Winchester, and I started the transaction, and then from outside there was a sound. Not loud, not a gunshot, not a shout, just boots on the boardwalk. A specific cadence, two men, heavy-heeled, not in a hurry, which is somehow worse than rushing. Men who aren't rushing have already decided something. The woman's breathing changed. I heard it. From 10 feet away, I heard it, this small, controlled tightening. Like she'd practiced keeping herself quiet under pressure, and the practice had held, but barely. The boots stopped outside the door. Vega put the Winchester on the counter and looked at me. His expression said nothing and everything. I said very quietly, "Those men out there." He said nothing. "They're looking for her." He still said nothing, but his hand moved, just slightly, toward the counter's edge, and I understood that he was not going to help her, and he was not going to stop them, and he was not going to stop me either, and whatever happened next was going to happen in about 30 seconds. I am not by nature an impulsive man. I keep ledgers. I document things. I like knowing the shape of a situation before I move inside it. I had approximately no shape to work with here. I picked up the Winchester. Vega blinked. "I'll take it," I said, "and the shells." I said it louder than I needed to, not aggressive, just loud enough to carry through a plank door. The boots outside didn't move. I loaded the rifle. Slowly, audibly. Not theatrically. I genuinely don't have a theatrical bone in my body. Ask anyone on the Calder spread, but deliberately. The sounds of the mechanism were clean and certain in the quiet shop. The boots moved. Not toward the door, away from it, down the boardwalk, still unhurried but away. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding and set 3 bills on Vega's counter. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully decipher, half relief, half something that might have been respect, or might have been warning. "She needs a doctor," I said. "There is no doctor who will see her," he said, simply, without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. I turned around. The woman was standing now. She'd gotten to her feet while I was at the counter, which told me something about her, that she didn't stay down any longer than she had to, even when staying down might have been easier. She was taller than I'd expected. She met my eyes without flinching, which told me something else. She said something in Apache. I don't speak Apache. I grew up in Missouri and then spent 6 years in Texas and the last 2 here. And in all that time I've learned approximately 40 words of Spanish and exactly none of the indigenous languages, because that's a failing of mine and of the entire culture I was raised in, and I'm not proud of it. But tone carries what words sometimes can't. She wasn't thanking me. She wasn't asking for help. She was assessing me. I understood that. I held still and let her do it. After a moment she said something else, shorter. Vega behind me translated quietly. She asks why. I thought about it. The honest answer was that I didn't know. The secondly honest answer was that I'd heard her breathing change, and something in me had responded before my brain caught up. The same way you pull your hand back from a hot surface before you've consciously registered the pain. I said, because those men were waiting and you were sitting. Vega translated. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she moved toward the back of the shop, toward the rear door, and she paused there and looked back. It was not an invitation exactly. It was more like a door left ajar. I looked at Vega. Take the back, he said. There's an alley. Then the dry wash that runs south. If they come back, I'll say you left with the rifle 20 minutes ago. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me, he said. Just go. The alley behind Vega's was narrow and smelled like rendered lard and horse droppings and sun-baked adobe. She was moving quickly for someone whose arm was braced like that, and I fell in behind her because there was no intelligent alternative. We reached the dry wash. She went down the bank without slowing, which told me she knew exactly where she was going. I followed, less gracefully, my boots slipping on loose shale. Down in the wash the light was different, muted, the walls on either side cutting the glare. It felt like being inside something rather than on top of it, which was either comforting or claustrophobic depending on your disposition. Mine leaned toward the former. Hers, I was rapidly learning, was harder to read. She stopped about 200 yards down, turned to face me. She said several things. Vega wasn't here to translate. We had the wash and the silence and the sound of my own nervous breathing, which I was trying to control with limited success. I held up my left hand, empty. She watched that for a moment. Then she lifted her right arm slightly, away from her ribs, and I understood she was showing me something. Showing me why she'd been sitting in that corner looking at the door. The fabric of her blouse was dark on the side, old blood. Not new, it had dried, browned, stiffened the cloth, but under it I could see the outline of a wound that hadn't been properly closed. I have a small personal medical kit in my saddlebag, because that's the kind of paranoid, documentation-minded person I am. I carry it the same way I carry the ledger, not because I expect to need it, but because my mother always said be the person who has the thing people need. I looked at the wound. I looked at her. She was watching my face with that same measuring expression. I said very carefully and uselessly, I can try to help. She didn't understand the words, but she watched my hands as I gestured toward the kit, toward her side, and her expression did something complicated, not softening exactly, more like recalculating. She gave a small, single nod. What I did next was not heroic. I want to be clear about that. I was clumsy. I was nervous. My hands, which are steadier than most when there's nothing at stake, developed a fine tremor the moment she pulled back the cloth and I saw the actual wound, a cut, deep and ragged, perhaps 3 inches long across her lower ribs, partially closed by what looked like an improvised compress of chewed herbs pressed into the gap. Someone had tended this. Someone knew what they were doing. That someone was not me. But the compress had shifted, and the wound had opened at one end, and it needed to be cleaned and redressed. And I had whiskey in the kit and clean strips of cloth, and a needle and gut thread that I had never used on a person, and was praying I wouldn't have to. I got lucky. The whiskey was enough. The herbs, whatever they were, had done their job. I redressed it with clean cloth, tied it firm but not tight, and the whole time she made no sound at all. Not one. I made 2 sounds, both involuntary, both from squeezing the wound edge to clear it. She looked at me with what I can only describe as professional patience. When I was done, She adjusted her blouse and looked at the dressing and said something quiet. I wrote it down phonetically in my ledger. I still have it 12 ledgers later. I still don't know exactly what it means. But a man I met 3 years later, a trader who'd spent decades in the territory, told me it was something close to, "You have a careful hand." We stayed in the wash for another hour. I didn't know what the right move was, so I did what I always do when I don't know what to do. I sat down and waited and watched. She ate something from a pouch she carried. She didn't offer me any, which I didn't expect, and then she did offer me some, which I didn't expect either. It was dried meat and something hard and faintly sweet, and I ate it without asking what it was because it seemed rude to ask, and also because I was genuinely hungry. The sun moved, the shadows in the wash shifted. She said something, and this time the meaning was clear from the gesture that accompanied it. She pointed south and down, indicating direction, indicating she had somewhere to be. I pointed the way I'd come, north. Back toward the wagon, the horse, the supply run I hadn't finished, the Winchester that was technically Calder's property, and that I was now holding in a dry wash outside Tucson, because I'd loaded it in a trading post to scare off 2 men I'd never seen before in my life. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said something else, short, with a slight, wry quality to it that crossed every language barrier in existence. I laughed. I don't know why. I genuinely don't. But I laughed, and she looked at me with that recalculating expression again, and then, just barely, just at the corner of her mouth, she did something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I walked her to where the wash bent south toward the foothills. At the bend she stopped, turned, looked at me one more time. I held out the bandana I'd used to wipe my hands after the dressing. Clean side. She looked at it, then at me, then she took it and folded it and placed it somewhere in her clothing with a kind of deliberate care that made it feel less like a transaction and more like something else. Something I didn't have a word for yet. She turned and walked south. I watched until she was out of sight. Then I climbed out of the wash and stood in the white Tucson sun and the creosote smell and wrote in my ledger. Did not complete purchase. Got the gun, got it loaded. Did not end up needing to fire it. Something else happened instead. Will try to explain later. I never did explain it, not adequately. Some things don't fit in ledgers. I should have been back at the Calder spread by early afternoon. I wasn't. Not because I was lost. I'd ridden that road enough times to do it in the dark, and I have done it in the dark, more than once. But because when I climbed back up from the dry wash and retrieved my horse from where I'd left her loosely tied on the north side of Vegas, I found that the horse wasn't alone. One of the 2 men was leaning against the hitching post. Just one, which in some ways was more unsettling than 2. 2 men are a confrontation. 1 man is a conversation you didn't ask for. He was tall, dressed like a territorial businessman rather than a cowhand, which in Tucson in 1883 was its own category of person. Someone with money and connections, and just enough frontier in his wardrobe to pretend he'd earned it. He had a watch chain and a good hat, and the particular kind of smile that men use when they want you to know they've already thought through several versions of what's about to happen. "That's a fine animal," he said, meaning my horse. "She does well enough," I said. My pulse was moving faster than I wanted it to. "You were in Vegas earlier," he said. "Most people who use Vegas were in Vegas earlier," I said. "That's how it works." He smiled at that, not because it was funny, because he was performing patience. His name, he offered it, which was its own move, was Garrett Holt. He said he was an agent for a land consortium operating out of Santa Fe. He said this the way people say things they want recorded and acknowledged, like he was reading from a deposition. I said that was interesting. He said there was a woman who had left the trading post around the same time I did. I said I hadn't noticed. He said the woman was a concern. I looked at him and said nothing, which is one of the more useful tools I have, and which I deploy infrequently enough that it tends to work. He explained unhurriedly that there was a situation, a piece of land, a question of who had filed certain paperwork. An Apache family. He used the word family with the same tone you'd use for complication, who had been living on a parcel that the consortium had acquired certain rights to, and the woman was a principal party to a dispute that was making its way through territorial court, and her presence in Tucson was, well. He paused. Inconvenient, I said. He smiled again. I was going to say premature. I've met men like Garrett Holt before. Not this specific man, not this specific scheme, but this configuration, the good hat, the measured speech, the legal vocabulary deployed as camouflage over something uglier underneath. You meet them everywhere the land is changing hands, and the people who were on it first are in the way. I knew what inconvenient meant. I knew what premature meant. I kept my face neutral and my hands still, and I said, well, I'm just here for the hardware store, and I've got a supply list to finish, so. I moved toward my horse. He stepped aside, which surprised me. He was the type to not step aside. Of course, he said, only if you happen to see her again. She has something that belongs to the consortium, a document. She likely doesn't know its value. If you were to come across it or her, the consortium would be very grateful. Gratitude like that tends to be quantifiable. He said it to my back. I untied the horse, mounted, and rode north. I rode north for about 6 minutes. Then I turned around. I am not an impulsive man. I've said that. I believe it about myself. But there's a thing that happens sometimes. A specific kind of clarity that arrives when you've been given a choice framed by someone else in terms that benefit them, and you suddenly see the actual shape of what's being asked, not the words, but the structure underneath them, and the structure is wrong, and you know it's wrong, and riding away from wrong doesn't make it right, it just makes you the person who rode away. My mother would have had something to say about that. She usually did. I went back to the wash. She wasn't there, obviously. She'd had nearly 2 hours. She was south, toward the foothills, and the foothills were a long walk from where I'd left her. I made a calculation, a bad one probably, or maybe not, I'm still not sure. I tied my horse at the wash's upper lip, took my canteen and the kit and left everything else, and went south on foot. The desert at midday in June is a specific experience that I have never been able to adequately describe in any of my 12 ledgers. It's not just hot. Hot is what you call water before it boils. What the Sonoran does to you is something more complete. It presses on you from every direction, above and below, the ground radiating back everything the sun put into it since sunrise, the air moving just enough to remind you that moving air is not the same as cool air. It takes your attention and holds it. You stop thinking about other things because the desert is insistent. I stopped thinking about Garrett Holt, which was probably useful. I started thinking about the woman and the document. She'd been in Vegas for a reason. Not shelter. Shelter doesn't require sitting in the corner of a commercial establishment watching the door. She'd been there to meet someone, or to wait for something, or to be in a place where a certain kind of transaction could happen without being visible. The Apache don't walk into trading posts casually, not in 1883, not in Tucson where the politics of land and law and belonging were wound so tight you could hear the pressure in people's voices. She'd had a reason. And those 2 men, one of whom was now using a watch chain and consortium language and the word premature, had followed her there. A document lands, territorial court. I know enough law to know that paperwork is its own kind of weapon. I've seen ranchers lose land they'd worked for a decade to men who understood filing deadlines better than they understood cattle. The law is a system, and systems can be worked, and people who look like Garrett Holt are usually very good at working them. The document she was carrying, if she was carrying it, was probably evidence, or a deed, or both, something that complicated what the consortium had acquired rights to. I kept walking south. I found her at the base of the first real rise, sitting in the shade of a palo verde tree with her back against the rock and her eyes closed. Not sleeping. I could tell from the way her hands were resting, slightly tensed, ready. She opened her eyes when I was still 20 feet out, which told me her hearing was better than mine, which honestly didn't surprise me. She looked at me with that expression I was beginning to understand as her baseline. Watchful, measuring, withholding judgment until judgment was necessary. I crouched down about 6 feet from her, not close, just close enough to talk. I said, "There's a man named Holt in town." "Nothing." I said, "He's looking for something. I think you have it." "Nothing." I opened my hands between us. Empty. I'd been doing this since the wash, this gesture, and I wasn't sure if it communicated what I meant or if it just made me look like I was begging for change. But it was all I had. I said, "Those men will come back." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said something and reached inside her clothing and produced a folded piece of paper. Not new, it was creased at every fold, worn at the edges, the kind of worn that comes from being carried for a while, from being important. She held it out. I didn't take it, not immediately, because taking it felt like a different kind of thing than everything I'd done so far, the Winchester, the dressing, the walk. Taking it was a choice with weight. I said, even though she couldn't understand me, "What do you need?" Her eyes didn't move from my face. Then she said something, and the word she used, I knew it, from the 40 words of Spanish I'd managed in 6 years, was one that crossed over. The same root, different tongue, different face, same meaning. Testigo. Witness. I took the paper. I didn't unfold it. Not there. It wasn't mine to unfold. It was hers, and she'd handed it to me the way you hand something to someone when you need them to carry it across terrain you can't cross yourself. I tucked it into my ledger pocket over my heart, and I stood up. She stood up. We looked at each other in the shade of the palo verde, and the desert pressed in from every direction and somewhere behind us, north, Garrett Holt was calculating how much more time he could afford to spend being patient. I said, "I know a man, a lawyer, in Tucson, but the good kind." He was a man named Aldis who'd helped 3 separate ranchers on the Calder side of the territory with land disputes. He was not corrupt, which in territorial Tucson was a short list of attributes. If that paper is what I think it is, he needs to see it. She watched my hands, the pocket where the paper was. Then she said something short, with that slight wry edge I'd heard once before, the same tone. Despite everything, I almost smiled. "Yeah," I said, "me too." We went back north as the sun started to move toward 4 o'clock. Not together exactly, she moved parallel to me, 20 feet to my left, which I understood was not distance but geometry. She was keeping her own sightlines clear. Professional, the same way the careful hands comment had been professional. She was someone who'd thought about survival in terms of angles and approaches and lines of retreat, and she was sharing the road with me, but she wasn't surrendering her own awareness. I respected that more than I can articulate. My horse was where I'd left her. We mounted up. I pulled the woman up behind me, which required a pantomime negotiation that I won't describe in detail, but which ended with her seated behind me with the firm, matter-of-fact grip of someone who has ridden before, but is making clear that this arrangement is functional rather than comfortable. We rode into Tucson from the east, which added 15 minutes but kept us off the main street. Aldis had his office above the assay building. He was in, which was luck, and he was sober, which was better luck, and when I explained, in summary, imprecisely, leaving out several things I wasn't sure how to include, he listened without interrupting, which was why he was good at his job. I gave him the paper. He unfolded it, read it. His expression did something careful, and controlled that I recognized as a man trying not to show that what he was reading was more significant than he'd expected. He looked at the woman. He said something in Apache. She responded. He said more. She responded more. I stood in the corner of Aldis's office and wrote in my ledger because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and the exchange lasted 10 minutes, and when it was over Aldis set the paper down and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his particular face before. "This is a prior claim," he said, "filed in 1871. It predates the consortium's acquisition by 8 years. I said nothing. "The consortium has been operating on the assumption that the original claim was lost," he said, "or destroyed, or that the family holding it could be pressured into." He stopped. I said, "Into inconvenience." He looked at me. Yes. She was watching both of us, processing what she could from tone and posture, and the particular way a man's face moves when the information he's reading is bad or good or complicated. She asked Aldis something. He answered. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that was longer than anything I'd heard her say, steady and measured, and without the careful tightening she'd had in Vegas. Aldis translated, sparing. She says her grandmother filed this. She says her grandmother told her to keep it no matter what. She says she has been keeping it for 11 years. I looked at the paper. 11 years. She'd have been maybe 19 when she started carrying it. Some things you write down and they sit in the ledger, and you look at them later and they still haven't gotten smaller. Holt came to Aldis's door at 6:15. I know the time because I was watching the window and I noted it. Old habit, my mother's doing. There were 3 of them this time. Holt, the second man I'd seen boots on the boardwalk, and a third I hadn't seen before who was wearing the kind of deputy's badge that doesn't necessarily mean what a deputy's badge is supposed to mean. Territorial politics had a long tradition of turning law into costuming. Aldis told me to take her out the back. "What about you?" I said. "I'm a lawyer," he said, and there was something dry in it, something that acknowledged the limitations of that protection while also suggesting he was prepared to exercise it as far as it went. "They can speak to me. That's what lawyers are for." He said it to her, too, in Apache. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked at me. She said something. Aldis translated. She says don't let them take the paper. "The paper's in your custody," I told him. He nodded. "I've already made a copy." I looked at him. "I'm a lawyer," he said again. We went out the back of the assay building into a narrow passage between structures that smelled like sulfur and heat and old timber. The sky above the passage was a deep copper rose, the sun low enough now that the air had dropped from unbearable to merely aggressive. She was ahead of me, and I was working to keep up. This was a reversal of the earlier dynamic, and I was aware of it. In Vegas, she'd been the one held still by circumstance, watching the door. Here, she was moving and I was following, and it felt correct, like the first arrangement had been a contingency, and this was the underlying truth. We came out the south end of the passage, and she stopped. She was looking at the street beyond, the main drag, West End, where the evening trade was starting to pick up. The saloon lanterns lit, men moving in the blue hour. She said something, pointed. I looked where she was pointing. There was a wagon outside the feed store, loaded and covered. A man I recognized, Kaler, who ran supplies to the southern ranches, climbing up onto the seat. She looked at me. "That wagon goes south," I said. She nodded, which meant she spoke more English than she'd indicated, which was, I noted mentally, entirely reasonable and very smart. I'm going to tell you something about that moment that I have not told anyone. Not Denny Briggs, who asked when I came back. Not Calder, who docked my pay for the missing afternoon. Not even the man I met 3 years later, who translated the words I'd written phonetically. I thought about not going. I thought I got her out of the trading post. I found Aldous. The paper is in legal custody. She has a wagon going south. I've done what I can do. I thought, Calder needs the wire and the feed sacks, and probably doesn't need me to involve myself further in territorial land disputes with consortium men who have deputy badges. I thought, this is not my situation, and I've already exceeded what most men would have done. All of that was true. And then I thought about the way her breathing changed in Vegas, the way it tightened, controlled, practiced, the way that practice implied repetition, that this wasn't the first time she'd had to make herself small and quiet while danger moved outside a door. I thought about 11 years of carrying a piece of paper. I went with her. Not because I decided to be heroic. I want to be clear about this because I've watched heroism get narrated onto events, and it makes the events smaller, not larger. It takes something complicated and uncertain and reduces it to a story where someone knew what to do. I didn't know what to do. I went because the alternative, standing in that passage and watching her go alone, felt like a thing I wouldn't be able to write in my ledger, and I've always taken that as a reasonable measure. If I can't write it down without it feeling wrong, I shouldn't do it. I caught Kaler before he got the wagon fully turned. I told him I needed a ride south for myself and my companion. He looked at her. He looked at me. He named a price. I paid it. We got in the back, behind the covered load. The wagon moved south out of Tucson in the last of the evening light, and after about 20 minutes she shifted against the wagon's sidewall and closed her eyes. Not fully. She had that half-present watchfulness even in rest, like a hawk perched and still but tracking, but enough that I understood the exhaustion underneath the composure. I opened my ledger. I wrote for a while, the day in order, the things I'd seen, the things I'd heard but not fully understood, the words she'd said that I'd written down phonetically, the weight of the paper before I handed it to Aldous, the quality of the light in the dry wash. After a while she spoke without opening her eyes. She said in English, careful English, accented but precise, "You write everything." I looked up from the ledger. She was watching me now, eyes open, with that measuring expression. "My mother told me to," I said. She considered this. "Mine also," she said, "but she told me to remember everything in here." She touched her temple. She said paper can be taken, memory cannot. I thought about that for a long time. Her name, she told me, was Nolly. Or rather, she said something longer, a full name in Apache, and then she said, "But Nolly is what you would remember." I said her name once, testing the sound. She corrected my pronunciation with the patience of someone who's done it many times and no longer takes it personally. I said it again. She made a small sound that wasn't quite approval, but was adjacent to it. She told me, in English that came with effort and precision and the occasional pause while she found the right word, some of what the document was. Her grandmother had understood in 1871 that the legal machinery was moving and that the machinery favored paper over presence, filing over living there. So she'd filed. She'd found a man in the territorial capital who would process it honestly, not out of altruism, but because he was new to the territory and didn't yet know which applications to lose, and she'd filed a land claim in proper legal form. She'd given it to Nolly's mother. Nolly's mother had given it to Nolly. When she died, I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Before, she said it was safer. I said nothing. "The men with the consortium," she said. "They came to the camp 3 months ago. They said the land was theirs now. They had paper. We had paper. They said ours was not real." She paused. "One of their men hurt my cousin. He was trying to get the document from her." The pause again. "She didn't have it. I had it." I looked at the wound I dressed, the dried blood, the 11 years of carrying. "You've been moving since then," I said. Yes. Where are you going? She told me. There was a man, not a lawyer, but someone who'd worked in the territorial capital and knew how the machinery worked, who had agreed to look at the claim, who might know which court to bring it to and when, and in front of which judge. It was a thin plan. She knew it was a thin plan. But it is a plan, she said, not defensively. Just stating the fact of it, the way you state weather. We rode in silence for a while. The desert at night is a different country than the desert at noon. The air cools fast in the Sonoran, dropping 20 degrees in an hour sometimes, the heat unwinding from the ground like smoke, and what's left is stars, and the call of a nightjar somewhere in the dark and the wagon wheels on packed earth. I thought about the copy Aldous had made. I thought about Holt at the door. I thought about a grandmother in 1871 walking into a territorial filing office and understanding that the world was changing faster than she could hold it back, but perhaps slow enough that a piece of paper, held long enough, in the right hands might matter. Can I ask something? I said. She looked at me. In Vegas, when you were sitting in the corner, you'd been there a while. I could tell from the way she'd been positioned, settled, not fresh. Were you waiting for someone? She was quiet. Yes, she said finally. Who? Another pause, longer. Someone who didn't come, she said. I didn't ask further. There was something final in the way she said it, not grief, exactly. More like a calculation updated. Someone who was supposed to carry the document forward and hadn't arrived, and so she'd had to carry it further herself, alone. The plan adjusted, the load redistributed. She kept moving. Kaler dropped us at a crossroads junction about 12 miles south of Tucson, where a smaller road cut east toward a settlement I half knew, and she apparently knew better. He was heading west from here, and he said so without apology and drove off into the dark, and that was the end of that particular transaction. We stood at the crossroads. The stars were enormous. The desert in every direction was the kind of dark that's not frightening so much as honest. It's like that everywhere, the stars, the space, the scale and the towns and the roads and the filing offices are the interruptions, not the other way around. She looked at the road east. She looked at me. You should go back, she said. Probably, I agreed. She seemed to be waiting for me to start going. I said, how far east? She told me about 3 miles, maybe 3.5. I'll walk you there, I said. You don't need to. I know. We walked east. The 3 miles took about an hour in the dark, moving carefully, her slightly ahead and me slightly behind, the Winchester across my arm, though I was hoping fervently that I wouldn't need it. Because a gunfight in the desert in the dark with no witnesses and no backup is the kind of thing that doesn't end well for anyone regardless of who's in the right. Nothing happened. The desert was just the desert, quiet in the way that has mass to it. We came to a cluster of low structures, not a town, not even really a settlement, more like a place where several things had been built in proximity because proximity helped. There were lights in one window. A dog barked once and was quiet. She stopped. She turned to look at me. We stood in the dark about 5 feet apart, and I was aware of the full weight of the day, the ledger entry, the Winchester, the dry wash, the dressing, the document, Aldous' face, Holt at the door, the wagon, the crossroads, these 3 miles. And also aware that I was never going to be able to explain this adequately in any ledger. She said something in Apache, the full version, several sentences. I listened to all of it. Then she held out her hand. Not in the way white men in Tucson shook hands, that performative grip. She held it out open, palm up, the way you offer something. I put my hand in hers. She pressed it once and released it. I walked back to the crossroads. I stood there for a few minutes in the enormous dark, looking at the stars, not writing in my ledger, just looking, which I don't do often enough. Then I started north, toward Tucson, toward my horse, toward the supply list I hadn't finished, toward Calder's docked pay and Briggs's questions. About a quarter-mile up the road I stopped. Reached into my ledger pocket. The document was gone. Aldous had it, that was right, I'd left it with Aldous. But the ledger was there. I opened it to the entry for June 14th, the one I'd written and crossed out. I crossed out the crossout. Then I wrote, underneath, in the smallest handwriting I had. She carried it 11 years. Paper can be taken, memory cannot. Today I was someone's witness. I don't know if it was enough. I don't know if anything I did today was enough. But I was there, and I saw it, and now it's written down. That's something. That's what my mother would have said. That's